In 1882 at St. Joseph, Jesse James fell to a shot from behind. Yet his name rose into a symbol both condemned and celebrated. In the years that followed, folded papers stained with charcoal and penciled arrows began to surface in private trunks, small-town newspapers, and barroom display cases across the Midwest. The paradox was plain. Criminal reports and elegiac columns about Jesse were repurposed as indirect testimony for treasure maps, from Clay County to the Ozarks. Former Confederates and border guerrilla sympathizers read the letters KGC as a promissory note of restitution, while cave owners and tour promoters recognized a ready-made brand. As a result, the legend of rebel gold did not travel through shafts in the earth, so much as through channels of publicity, binding wartime raiders to peacetime brochures. From that contradiction, a timeline emerges in which maps and KGC symbols expand from rumor to itinerary. And that timeline sets the frame for what the evidence can and cannot bear. A quarter-folded sheet, heavy stock gone yellow, a small circle like a compass rose beside the three letters KGC, and a scatter of arrows that follow the Missouri River, then bend toward the Ozarks. That object is less a warrant to dig than a prop for a shared imagination. Enlarged after the April shooting in 1882, from taverns in Clay County to front pages in Kansas City, each retelling of Jesse James attached a new coordinate, a fresh device. Sometimes an ill-placed numeral, sometimes a cipher that looked borrowed from a campaign log. Many of these scraps lack a creation date and a named hand, yet they still fueled a habit of drawing open-air atlases on top of patchwork memories. The outlaw became an anchor point, the symbol a line between points, and the blank spaces filled with a mix of grievance and anticipation that made every arrow feel close to a payday. Once the symbols entered daily life, their path rested on three pillars. First, the border war memory across Kansas and Missouri, where Jesse James stepped from Quantrill's bands, and the circle around Bloody Bill Anderson, leaving traces at Liberty, Gallatin, and Northfield. Second, the Reconstruction-era press, where writer John Edwards elevated the persona of the defiant rebel well beyond the police file. Third, the local economy. Pinkerton men pushed in, the James farm endured a bloody raid, and family hardship added urgency to every rumor. In that setting, many maps read more like newspaper language than field notes, and the iconic letters operated as a cue to remember, not a coordinate system. Cave mouths, river bends, and place names familiar to the region gave these sheets an aura of plausibility that strict surveying could not confirm. At the outer layer sits the question of why KGC. Those letters were attached to Knights of the Golden Circle, a secretive order that lived most vividly in the minds of former Confederates as a guardian of wartime reserves. However, most papers bearing the symbol travel without provenance, custody, or a documented chain. They appear where communities need a master key to unlock an imagined vault, then persist because they pair the most famous outlaw of the late 19th century with the most portable promise a story can offer. When symbols have sunk in that far, caves like Robbers Cave and Merrimack Caverns step forward as ready backdrops. Darkness, cool air, mineral seams, and adventurous names do the heavy lifting. Owners point to smudged marks on limestone, stitch KGC into a guided route, and sell a ticket that doubles as a certificate of participation in history edited for the gift shop. Reading that mechanism like a cross-section of sediment reveals an intimate braid between characters and places. Jesse James supplies the name. Quantrill and Bloody Bill supply the milieu, and Clay County, Liberty, and Northfield supply the fixed posts. The result is a cycle in which a map feels convincing because it hangs the past on a geography the public already knows. In that condition, KGC is less a promise to extract ore than a brand applied to borderland memory. A device that sells tours, sells paper, and survives retelling across generations. A half step back shows how such maps are built from repeating parts. Names are spaced at a steady rhythm. Arrows hug rivers and roads, and symbols cluster near natural entrances. Before publication, they tend to avoid occupied farms, formal survey markers, and courthouse property books. Repetition occurs because the source is not a war diary archive, but a pile of news items and oral lore. When one map successfully produces suspense, it spawns near copies, with minor substitutions made to suit an audience in a different county. That explains how the same symbol system can appear far from any plausible logistical route on a physical atlas. Evaluate this material with a bright light, and the prologue of Maps plus KGC demands a basic screen. The first question is authorship, and whether the hand can be traced. The second is whether ink, pencil, and paper age match the claimed moment. The third is whether position aligns with independently inventoried sites. Without all three, a map is an artifact of imagination. With one, it remains a narrative piece. With two or more, it merits a field query, not a shovel. That filter keeps the tempo of inquiry steady before moving to the origin story of KGC. The post-1870s boom in rumor, and the case of caves refitted for tourism. From there, the social engine that powers the legend becomes clearer. Newspapers seek vivid local color. Proprietors seek footfall. And families displaced by war seek meaning in a name that refuses to go quiet. Meanwhile, agencies like Pinkerton and county sheriffs publish circulars that sharpen the outline of the outlaw, while unintentionally giving gossip a scaffold. In turn, a sheet of arrows becomes a token of participation in a regional story. The symbol lifts into a flag for border identity, and the cave tour becomes a ritual of belonging disguised as a hunt. Consequently, any responsible treatment of rebel gold starts with curating the archive of claims, not amplifying it. The last move in this opening case is a practical yardstick. Date every sheet. Demand a provable chain of custody. Cross-check any mark on stone against non-promotional surveys, and separate showpiece narratives from records that can survive lab work. If those steps sound plain, that is the point. Rebel gold flourishes in the gap between hope and proof. Closing that gap does not kill the story. It repositions a folk atlas as what it largely is at this stage of the series. A map of how legends move through print, tourism, and memory. Later cases can then test KGC's actual origins. The Robbers Cave and Merrimack Caverns narratives, the incentives of modern treasure hunting, and the 2001 DNA effort with standards that do not bend to a headline. In the 1860s, the Knights of the Golden Circle were whispered about as a clandestine network built on secrecy, oaths, and a vision of Southern expansion. By the 1880s, those same three letters had migrated to picnic banjos, county fairs, and cave brochures as shorthand for a shared past. A code that once promised shadows now functioned like a flag in daylight. The paradox is not accidental. After the war, borderland towns needed a vocabulary for memory that could hold loss, stubborn pride, and the wish that something valuable had been saved from defeat. KGC fit that need. It sounded official, it looked cryptic on paper, and it let communities gesture toward hidden reserves without naming who held them. The letters slid from ward meetings and lodge halls into newspaper sketches and church socials, where a smudge on stone or a triangle on a tree could be retold as a clue. In practice, the symbol became a social adhesive. It linked veterans to younger men, merchants to editors, and farm families to a regional story larger than their own fields. Once anchored to Jesse James, the emblem gained a hero and a headline, which gave every retelling a center of gravity that ordinary local lore rarely holds. The route from rumor to emblem traveled through institutions people already trusted. Fraternal lodges supplied rituals and titles that lent a patina of order. County weeklies supplied typeset columns that turned porch talk into print. Courthouse reunions and cemetery dedications supplied dates, photographs, and the comfort of public ceremony. In that civic setting, KGC served as a convenient capsule. It could stand in for Confederate memory without reciting manifestos. It could be painted on a sign near a cave entrance without a sermon. It could be penciled on a map in a family Bible, or slipped into a scrapbook beside a parade ribbon. The icon moved because it solved a need. It allowed people to dramatize endurance without inviting the law, and to imagine reserves of gold without the burden of proof that banks demand. The hand that drew the letters might change from town to town, yet the effect was stable. The community could point, nod, and agree that the past was still present, tucked just out of sight. For analysis, it helps to map the channels that carried the letters into common use. One channel was organizational. The late 19th century was thick with lodges, encampments, and benefit societies that trained men to read signs, exchange passwords, and keep minutes. That habit of mind made a chalk mark look like a rite instead of a stain. Another channel was commercial. General stores, railway depots, and touring lecturers needed themes that sold tickets and newsstand copies. A tight three-letter cipher delivered both. A third channel was commemorative. Veterans' columns and memorial days taught families to stitch private grief into public narrative, a practice that primed readers to accept the idea of a hidden trust waiting to be claimed. When these channels braided together, KGC could pass from a name in a tract to an everyday emblem. The spread did not require central command. It required repetition across familiar stages, where reputation acts like currency. A second lens is semantic drift. Words and marks gain new meanings when they are reused in new contexts. KGC began as a badge within a specific political project, and ended up as a label for any cash rumor with a southern accent. The shift did not erase the origin. It diluted it. That dilution increased the letter's utility, because a blurred meaning can travel farther. Editors could invoke KGC to tease a serialized column without endorsing a platform. Cave owners could promise a brush with intrigue without citing a ledger. Families could claim continuity with wartime ancestors without footnoting a constitution. The elastic meaning kept risk low and interest high. However, that same elasticity also weakened evidentiary value. A mark that can mean anything proves nothing on its own. The result is a symbol that does excellent work for identity and poor work for proof. A third lens is the border economy of attention. Missouri and Kansas counties in the Reconstruction and Gilded Age competed for rail stops, fairs, and county seat prestige. Symbolic capital was not ornamental, it paid rent. A cave with a KGC tail could command a fee. A newspaper with a Jesse sidebar could edge out a rival across the river. A hardware store that displayed a map could host foot traffic that bought nails. Meanwhile, ministers and school teachers who disliked outlaw law could still tolerate the letters as folklore if it kept peace between former foes at a picnic. Attention is the scarcest good in a small market, and KGC functioned as a reliable attractor that crossed class lines. The pattern is visible in later tourist economies, but its template is already present in the 1880s Midwest, where names, places, and symbols were traded like goods on a counter. From these lenses, the conversion of KGC from rumor to emblem looks less like an accident and more like an adaptive reuse. The letters became a toolkit. Communities picked what they needed. A parade banner took one piece. A serialized column took another. A guided tour took a third. Therefore, when we weigh any artifact that bears the mark, we should separate its social function from its factual claim. The first explains why it spread. The second demands tests it often cannot pass. Keeping that distinction clear allows the story to be told without surrendering standards. It also sets the stage for the next case, which examines why the boom accelerated after the 1870s press cycle, and how that cycle locked KGC into the public vocabulary of Jesse James country. In the 1870s, a strange arithmetic governed the border states. Every arrest circular, telegraph bulletin, and front page intended to box the James boys in also expanded their footprint in the public mind. Editors chased circulation with serialized crime features. Telegraph offices synchronized headlines across counties overnight, and railway timetables moved those papers farther than horseback rumor ever could. The Northfield disaster in 1876, the Pinkerton raid on the James farm the year before, and a chain of bank and train cases delivered a steady supply of dates, places, and names that could be glued to any map bearing 3 letters. In effect, law and publicity became twins. Agencies wanted faster notice to catch fugitives. Printers wanted louder notice to catch readers. Communities wanted familiar notice to knit a wounded identity back together. When those wants aligned, the conditions for a boom were in place. And the letters KGC slid into that current like a boat onto a fast river. The press wave had a texture that rewarded symbols. County weeklies depended on set pieces with predictable beats, an ambush paragraph, a posse paragraph, a neighborhood recollection, and a moral at the end. Those beats paired neatly with the simple grammar of treasure sheets, arrows, initials, and the landmark. By contrast, patient archival work rarely fit the news hole. It lacked the action verbs needed for columns that kept a town talking from Saturday to Saturday. So the short forms won. A clipped note about a cave, a few initialed letters in a margin, a timetable of sightings that hopped along the new rails. When Jesse James was named, the symbol found a face. And when a face drew crowds, the symbol found a market. The mechanics of publication mattered as much as the stories. Cheap wood pulp lowered the cost of mistakes and made it easy to print rumors that could be disowned in the next issue. Stereotype plates let a single column about a sighting or a raid appear in multiple towns with minimal effort. Exchange editors built networks in which a Jesse paragraph posted in St. Louis could be reprinted in Leavenworth in the same week, then clipped into a scrapbook where a map was already taking shape beside a ribbon from a fair. In the meantime, traveling lecturers and museum shows carted relics of the war to opera houses and halls, where intermission talk joined dots between letters on a wall and names in a column. The more the press standardized the tale, the easier it became for a 3-letter cipher to be understood without a glossary. Telegraphy and rail were not the only conduits. The Postal Service seeded dime novels and detectives' memoirs across the countryside, Those paperbacks taught readers to expect codes, caches, and confessions delivered in tidy arcs. A farm boy who learned to spot the clue on page 30 learned to spot one on a cave wall. To that end, the boom in literacy after the war furnished not only new readers, but new interpreters. Church reading circles, lodge minutes, and school composition books offered practice in turning signs into stories. When a sheet with KGC appeared, it entered a culture already trained to finish the pattern. The habit of conclusion outran the habit of corroboration. The economics behind the press wave completed the circuit. Advertisers paid for attention, not accuracy. A column that mentioned Jesse James pulled eyes to a general store block that paid for ink. A railroad that wanted excursion traffic smiled on a cavern story that promised adventure within a day's ride. A county board that needed fair attendance approved programs that leaned into local color. Editors were not puppeteers, but they were not neutral either. They lived by subscriber counts, and their incentives lined up with symbols that converted easily into headlines, posters, and speeches. An outlaw's name was a turnkey. A three-letter mark was the key. If we chart the sequence across 1870 through 1882, a pattern appears. First come the raids and the manhunts, which provide the names and dates. Next come the condemnations and defenses in print, which provide the frame of meaning. Then come the tours, the souvenirs, and the retellings, which provide the channels through which a symbol can travel without facing a courtroom. At each stage, KGC benefits from being easy to draw, easy to remember, and easy to pin to a place already in the news. The boom is not reducible to belief in a hidden reserve. It is a function of communication systems turning scattered grief and pride into a shared narrative, with three letters serving as its logo. Analysis clarifies why the late 1870s were the hinge. Communications accelerated, and with acceleration came synchronization. Synchronization made motifs legible across counties that had never shared a front-page rhythm before. A lawman in one town and a promoter in another could act on the same rumor within days, which is how a mark on limestone, a paragraph in a weekly, and a talk on a stage converged into a regional storyline. The boom followed the press wave, because the press wave standardized attention. Once attention was standardized, symbols prospered. They required no committee, no treasury, and no headquarters. They needed repetition. The press supplied it. The press supplied it. A second analytical thread is the supply of mediators who bridged outlaw coverage and memorial culture. Editors who admired courage, even in the wrong cause, gave space to rhetoric about honor and persecution. Lodge officers who managed secrets and rituals lent those habits to readers who then read secrecy into chalk. Veterans groups that organized reunions gave photographers and stenographers reasons to circulate among the very families whose names were on treasure sheets. These mediators did not conspire to create a boom. They simply carried compatible practices from one sphere to another until the letters KGC looked native wherever they landed. Finally, the press wave taught communities how to monetize their own past without waiting for distant capitals to approve. That lesson stuck. When a cave owner painted a sign, when a newspaper framed a map as heritage rather than hearsay, when a deputy tolerated a tour because it kept tempers down, the boom found its stable base. The letters were portable, legible, and morally flexible enough to satisfy readers who wanted closure, and visitors who wanted a thrill. The result was not proof of treasure. It was proof of how a symbol can flourish when technology, commerce, and memory move in the same direction. In 1882, at St. Joseph, the outlaw's life closed and the folk figure opened. Prints and pamphlets that once chased the James boys now lingered on poses that softened edges, framed a saddle as a throne, and traded mugshots for portraiture. The border of Missouri and Kansas supplied a ready backdrop. Town names already threaded through headlines gave the myth places to stand, from Liberty and Gallatin to the failed Northfield job. Surviving farm families who hated raids could still recognize the cadence of those names when sung in a ballad or stamped on a souvenir. The paradox became a hinge. Death fixed the biography, yet memory expanded the character. Newspaper sketches lost their urgency and gained a glow, especially when retold in parlors that mixed grief with pride over endurance after the war. Nevertheless, the warmth came from selection rather than proof, a curating of scraps into a pattern that a border audience was primed to receive. The pattern leaned on a few steady props. Railroads and banks stood in for distant power. Pinkerton men, with their circulars and broad hats, stood in for intrusion. Rural crossroads, where a clerk might know every family by name, stood in for the moral center. Into that stage walked Jesse James as a figure who spoke a language the region already understood. The script was not complicated. He was cast as the man who refused humiliation, who outwitted a posse by knowing the back roads, who shared a meal at a farmhouse and left coins on the table. Clay County landmarks supplied anchors. Quantrill's legacy supplied a martial frame. Newspaper language that once accused was edited into praise by subtraction, until the outlaw looked less like a suspect and more like a symbol of border stubbornness. 2 decades of rumor and ritual taught readers where to place each scene, and the outline hardened into a role that later promoters could quote like a line from a play. The Robin Hood mold worked because it fit the region's narrative needs more snugly than any ledger could. In practice, the role offered 3 conveniences at once. First, it converted scattered episodes into a moral arc, where raids against corporate property looked like reprisals rather than theft. Second, it allowed communities to express defiance safely by praising cunning instead of bloodshed. Third, it simplified a messy civil conflict into a story with familiar furniture. A forest traded for oak scrub. A sheriff traded for a railroad detective. A castle traded for a bank vault. When the furniture is familiar, audience labor drops, and the story travels quickly without instruction. That speed made the mold attractive to editors and lecturers who needed clarity on a deadline. It also made it attractive to families who wanted their local past to read as dignity rather than disorder. There were structural reasons the mold held. The Reconstruction and Gilded Age border economy valued names that could pull a crowd and calm a room. A Jesse narrative offered both. It gathered former foes under a neutral roof by shifting attention from motive to mastery. It made room for veterans to feel seen without arguing platforms. It gave schoolteachers a way to talk about courage while skipping the parts that divide a class. Accordingly, the myth turned into a public utility. It could be borrowed for a parade float, clipped for a column, quoted at a picnic, and printed on a handbill for a lecture in a church hall. Once the uses multiplied, the meaning drifted toward whatever purpose the day required, which is how a man wanted for robbery could be cited as an emblem of neighborhood care in the space of a decade. Yet the mold had costs that the legend rarely itemized. The Robin Hood pose implies redistribution, mercy, and a code that protects the weak. Evidence for those features in the James record is thin where it is not absent. Receipts and deposit books do not show coins moving from robberies to widows. Court files do show casualties and fear. The myth's strongest proof is aesthetic rather than archival. It looks right on a playbill, and sounds right in a chorus. As such, it functioned as a tool for community feeling, rather than a map to behavior. That tool can be studied without contempt. It can also be separated from claims about treasure or secret funds that piggybacked on the story. When that separation is kept, the Robin Hood frame becomes a datum about border identity, not a credential for any cash. A clear account therefore distinguishes between three layers. The first is the individual, whose documented acts belong to law and history. The second is the role, whose scenes belong to print and stage. The third is the emblem, whose uses belong to community ritual. Confusion arises when the second and third are read back into the first, turning convenience into claim. The remedy is neither denunciation nor surrender. It is to fix standards for which statements go in which drawer, and to mark when a sentence is doing emotional work rather than evidentiary work. That approach keeps admiration for nerve from mutating into a license for invention. This case prepares the ground for the caves. Once a man becomes a role and a role becomes an emblem, geology can be scripted as scenery. Robbers Cave and Merrimack Caverns did not need ledgers to participate. They needed a hero who had already been recast, a symbol that already traveled, and an audience trained by newspapers to spot a clue on stone. The next case takes that stage and shows how darkness, cool air, and a cash box at the entrance transformed the myth from a porch story into a tour route, with tickets functioning as proofs of belonging rather than proofs of gold. In the early 20th century, a limestone labyrinth beside the Merrimack River gained a new identity when promoters began linking its chambers to Jesse James. A cave that formed over geologic time was repackaged as a gallery of scenes, each chamber assigned a title that sounded like a chapter from an outlaw chronicle. The drawer was not only underground beauty, but the promise that a famous fugitive had once used these bends as cover. As a result, a natural resource acquired a narrative spine strong enough to carry tickets, brochures, and a steady flow of excursion traffic. Farther across the borderlands, places called Robbers Cave, or its variants, adopted a similar script. Darkness, cool air, and tight passages created instant atmosphere, and the three letters, K, G, C, could be pointed out on any stain or scratch that suited the tour. The performance did not demand ledger entries. It demanded a name, a symbol, and a route that could be walked in under an afternoon. The stagecraft followed familiar steps. Guides rehearsed a cadence that alternated between geology and legend. Placards set a tone. Lantern light carved shadows that suggested secrecy. And souvenir stands translated sensation into a take-home token. In practice, the outlaw angle carried the weight. Visitors would recall the room where a lookout supposedly stood, or the ledge where loot was rumored to rest, while the calcite and flowstone became supporting cast. The cave itself did part of the work. Drips, echoes, and a fixed coolness encouraged a sense of time suspended, and that sense made 19th century names feel present. However, what audiences left with was a story trimmed for clarity, a route that ended at a cash box, and a memory that treated conjecture as a feature, not a flaw. The attraction model prospered because it was modular. A cave with a convenient entrance near a road could import the package. A Jesse association, a KGC flourish, and a guide script that allowed facts and folklore to sit side by side. Therefore, an operator did not need to prove a hideout. The business could thrive by offering a brush with possibility, and by framing the cave as a monument to border resilience. Meanwhile, newspapers reinforced the loop by reviewing tours, and reprinting anecdotes from visitors who thought they had seen a sign. The elements repeated from site to site, until the template itself became the commodity. In that template, geology supplies awe, outlaw law supplies suspense, and commerce supplies continuity. From an analytical angle, the cave stories rest on three pillars that deserve separate tests. First is material evidence. Tool marks, lead residue, cartridge cases, or period artifacts must be tied to datable layers rather than to recent handling. Second is inscription evidence. Initials or symbols on stone should be documented in situ with a verifiable chain, and their letter forms compared to period hands rather than to modern imitations. Third is documentary evidence. Claims that name a chamber or a cache need corroboration from letters, diaries, or arrest records that place specific people in specific places. Without those tests, the cave narrative remains a designed experience that says more about regional memory than about outlaw logistics. A second thread is infrastructure. Tourist caves surged when roads improved and rail excursions became affordable. Billboards and pamphlets standardized expectations long before a visitor saw a stalactite. That standardization shaped perception inside the cave, priming guests to interpret shadows as proof. It also shaped local economies that came to depend on steady flow, which encouraged scripts that favored continuity over debate. Guides who questioned a legend risked breaking the spell. Guides who leaned into it kept the line moving. The result is a market in which narrative efficiency outruns evidentiary caution. A final thread is ethics. Communities have a right to tell stories that bind generations, and caves offer a powerful setting to practice that right. Yet the same setting can make weak claims feel unearned. The remedy is simple to state and harder to keep. Label conjecture as conjecture. Keep archives open for inspection, and invite independent surveys that can separate mineral history from human history. When those practices hold, caves can remain theaters of wonder without being treated as vaults of proof. The Jesse link then reads as folklore that organizes memory, rather than as a credential for KGC treasure maps. And the tour remains a civic ritual, instead of a promise that geology cannot keep. Drought years and tight credit pushed border counties to look for names that could pull visitors, and the outlaw's name did that work on demand. Because a recognizable figure beats an anonymous bluff on a map, proprietors began pinning Jesse James to crossroads, overlooks, groves, and caves that sat within a day's ride of a depot. A hand-painted sign could redirect travelers from the pike to a refreshment stand. A postcard rack could turn a rock ledge into a story stop. A Saturday column could turn a rumor into a route. As a result, ordinary features entered a circuit of commerce where curiosity had a price, and place names were treated like fixtures in a stage set. The product was not only a tour, but a feeling that the country still held pockets of unfinished business. And that feeling translated into cash at the counter. Once the pattern proved itself at a cave or a spring, neighboring towns copied the kit. A headline, a marker with 3 letters, a path with 3 or 4 pauses, and a box for tickets near the exit. The more copies appeared, the less any one site had to carry the burden of proof. It only had to carry the brand. On the ground, the steps repeated with small local variations. A livery tacked up a board pointing to a supposed lookout. A grocer kept a clipping near the scale. A lodge invited a lecturer to retell the same 3 episodes with new place names. Each element did modest work alone. Together, they made a weekend program that a family could follow without hiring a guide. The route promised proximity rather than certainty. and the purchase was a claim on participation, rather than a claim on evidence. Therefore, the waypoint became a unit of retail memory. It could be added or subtracted from a circuit without breaking the spell, so long as the letters and the outlaw stayed in view. The mechanism behind those waypoints has three moving parts. First is the supply of locations that already had names in circulation. A bluff with a local nickname, or a churchyard with an annual picnic, offered a ready socket for a fresh plaque. Second is the supply of media that can copy a frame without copying facts. County weeklies reused a template of map, anecdote, and quotation marks that made one site look like a cousin of another. Third is the supply of incentives that make repetition rational. A proprietor wants footfall, a printer wants subscribers, and a council wants a reason for excursion trains to stop. In that triangle, the waypoint functions like a coupon. It redeems attention at the counter where money changes hands. A second layer concerns branding. A name capable of carrying across counties behaves like a mark that can be licensed without paperwork. In practice, the license was informal and contagious. A route that began at a cave could spill into a town square. A square could spill into a spring. A spring could spill into a bluff. And each spill justified a new sign that kept the brand alive. Consequently, a loose federation of stops emerged, none of which had to verify its place in a 19th century itinerary to justify its 20th century use. The trade accepted a simple test. If a site helped visitors imagine a scene and buy a keepsake, it earned its slot in the circuit. The costs of that system are easiest to see when standards are asked to do work they were never hired to do. A branded waypoint can sell lemonade, raise money for a county fair, and keep a depot open through a slow season. It cannot authenticate a cache. It cannot convert repetition into corroboration. The risk grows when printed circuits harden into local pride, because pride resists renegotiation. Operators who add hedges to their scripts may face quieter rooms. Editors who add caveats to their columns may face thinner mailbags. That pressure encourages language that leans on mood rather than on proof. And over time, mood can begin to masquerade as method. A practical response keeps the virtues of the circuit while refusing the leap from commerce to confirmation. One approach is to separate the entertainment layer from the evidentiary layer in public language. A county website can celebrate a Jesse-themed stroll without promising provenance. A plaque can present the law while directing readers to archives that remain open for inspection. A proprietor can grant access to independent survey teams outside of tour hours, so that tools and samples do not get conflated with souvenirs. These steps stabilize the brand by showing that it does not fear scrutiny, and they protect the archive from being asked to pay debts that belong to a cash drawer. A further analysis treats the waypoint as a dataset rather than a claim. Map the sites, date the earliest mentions, and log the business models attached to each one. Sites that mature into anchor stops tend to have 4 traits. They sit near transportation. They possess a striking physical feature that photographs well. They accumulate repeatable stories that fit a 30-minute loop. And they maintain a channel into the local paper. When those traits are present, a Jesse label will likely stick even if the underlying lore is thin. When those traits are missing, the label fades, regardless of how sincere the promoter is. Measured this way, the circuit can be studied as a market in attention rather than as a vault to be opened. The same market logic explains why neighboring counties often duplicate one another's claims. Scarcity of major landmarks makes duplication tempting, and a famous name lowers the cost of invention. Yet, duplication is not only imitation. It is also a way for communities to signal membership in a shared border identity. A cave with a Jesse room and a square with a Jesse bench are both badges of belonging to a storyline that the region has agreed to carry. That belonging has value on its own terms. It supplies a language for reunions, school lessons, and summer programs. It can be honored without being confused for a provenance statement. Finally, monetization reached far beyond caves and bluffs, into festivals, lodge programs, and even charity drives. A pie auction under a banner that quotes a ballad can raise funds, because the banner gives the room a theme and gives donors a role. A children's pageant that stages a chase across a gym floor can give grandparents a stage to remember names without relitigating the war. These uses are not abuses. They are forms of cultural maintenance. Trouble begins when a fundraising voice borrows the cadence of a field report, and when a souvenir display borrows the confidence of a ledger. Clear labels and open archives cure most of that trouble. When the lines hold, local promoters can keep their circuits alive without drafting the outlaw into claims that the evidence cannot carry. In the closing years of the 19th century, gaudy paperbacks lined general store counters with titles that promised codes, caches, and last-minute escapes. A familiar name on the cover did much of the lifting, and the letters KGC, rendered as a clue or a curse, did the rest. By the 19-teens, Nickelodeon stitched similar beats into two real chases, where a lantern in a cave, a chalked symbol on stone, and a narrow escape delivered the rhythm that readers already knew by heart. When sound arrived, the pattern tightened. A ballad could sanctify a fugitive, a courtroom scene could add moral color, and a closing tableau could leave the audience certain that one more stash was still out there. The plot did not need a ledger. It needed a face, a sign, and a place with shadows. Merchants stocked the paperbacks beside plug tobacco and patent medicine. Exhibitors booked the serials between newsreels and travelogues. The result was a pipeline that carried outlaw imagery into the same rooms where families shopped and cheered. And that pipeline lit the treasure story from within, long after the headlines had cooled. Covers and posters made the iconography portable. A compass rose beside three initials could sit in the corner of a frame without slowing the action, while a map with an X could anchor a lobby card without explaining provenance. The repetition taught recognition. Readers learned to expect the clue before the hero did, and viewers learned to pass a war mark as foreshadowing. Pulp magazines added filler pieces that recapped older rumors as if they were prequels. Later, studio publicists borrowed town names from the borderlands to grant texture, even when principal photography never left California. The traffic went both ways. A theater display might borrow a cave name from a brochure, and a brochure might borrow a lobby still from a theater, creating the impression that proofs existed somewhere just off stage. Over time, fiction arranged the mental atlas that non-fiction was expected to match. The supply chain behind this glow explains its durability. Cheap wood pulp, syndicated plates, and national distributors lowered the cost of repetition, while a template of chase, standoff, and reveal lowered the cost of writing. A three-letter cipher could fit the template without legal risk, and a famous name could carry a story across county and state lines. Moreover, the business rewarded clarity over qualification. A crisp trope that sold at a glance beat an archive that required patience. Editors preferred tight columns to careful footnotes. Producers preferred legible props to ambiguous claims. The incentives did not require conspiracy. They required speed. A second analysis concerns how imagery primes interpretation. Lurid cover art and stark poster glyphs trained audiences to treat certain shapes as evidence. A triangle on bark or a circle on limestone could feel certified because it matched what the paperback had already taught them to see. That effect scaled when theaters added songs and taglines that promised reckoning and reward, since melody and motto make marks easier to recall. Nonetheless, recognition is not corroboration. When a symbol can mean many things across books and reels, it proves little outside them. The very flexibility that makes KGC a strong brand in fiction makes it a weak test in the field, unless paired with dated, documented context. A third thread is the feedback loop between entertainment and local promotion. Studios mined regional lore for set dressing. Towns mined studio imagery for legitimacy. That cross-borrowing gave caves and bluffs a sheen of inevitability, as if a story and a site had grown up together. Thus, a tourist route could talk like a treatment, and a paperback could read like a guide. The hazard is obvious. When narrative efficiency becomes the highest good, the standard for proof drifts toward whatever serves the next beat. The remedy is not to close the book or dim the projector. It is to keep the pleasures of pulp and film in their proper drawer, and to ask of any physical mark or paper scrap the questions that fiction never has to answer. Who made it? When? And under what chain of custody? Kept in that order, the glow can be enjoyed as art, without being mistaken for evidence. A fresh current carried the legend into new water. A photograph of 3 letters chalked on limestone could circulate from a creek bank to a national audience in a single day, and a handheld video of a sign near a fence line could collect hundreds of comments before sunset. The equipment was ordinary: a phone, a drone, and a weekend's worth of enthusiasm. The setting was familiar: a river bend, a bluff with a name, a cave entrance that locals had walked past for years. Yet the effect differed from porch talk because attention scaled without friction. A claim that once lived in a barroom could now live in a feed where the algorithm favored novelty, speed, and certainty. In that environment, minor clues turned into major headlines, and maps that reused old motifs acquired new authority because repetition masqueraded as peer review. As a result, Rebel Gold traveled on broadband, and modern hunters found themselves cast as both researchers and performers. Weekend rallies took shape around that dual role. Small teams printed laminates, borrowed phrases from older brochures, and overlaid arrows on satellite base maps that already bore the friendly curves of rivers the audience knew by name. A metal detector sweep beside a churchyard became a teaser clip. A walk through a culvert became an episode. Meanwhile, forums and group chats stitched participants into a loose confederacy where each fragment, an initial on bark, a triangle scratched into mortar, could be offered for remote inspection. The more pieces arrived, the more the pattern felt complete, even when sources were thin and chains of custody were short. Over time, the hunt performed itself. A live stream at a promising hole drew donations for better gear. A claim that trended earned a guest spot on a podcast. A podcast mention drew visitors to a town that welcomed the footfall. The loop closed neatly. Attention funded the search. The search fed the feed. And the feed sold the feeling that something buried was getting closer. The architecture of that loop can be described without malice. Supply rises because it is fun to look and easy to post. Demand rises because the story is simple to follow and simple to share. Platforms reward creators who deliver clear arcs inside tight time boxes, which means a clean symbol beats a careful proviso. Therefore, clips compress context, captions oversimplify, and stills isolate the one angle that confirms a hope, while cropping away what contradicts it. None of this requires bad faith. It requires a sequence in which engagement outruns verification. Once that sequence is in motion, Confirmation drift follows. A mark that resembles a KGC letter in one county is used to identify a related mark in another, and soon a family of shapes travels like a trademark across places that never shared a ledger. A second layer is incentive stacking. Hobbyists enjoy the chase, but modern hunts add revenue to the fun. Advertising, sponsorships, affiliate links, and tour tie-ins sit beside genuine curiosity, and the mix is hard to disentangle in public. Moreover, local authorities who benefit from visitors may tolerate ambiguous claims if the result is a full diner and a happy depot. None of those incentives are illegal. They are simply aligned with growth rather than restraint. Growth prefers declarative sentences, and declarative sentences become habits. When the habit sets, even careful voices begin to speak in a headline cadence that puts a claim before a test and invites the test only if the claim survives the week. The third layer is epistemic hygiene, a phrase that sounds clinical because the work is. Modern hunters who want their findings to survive inspection can borrow norms from fields that have learned to live with cameras. Timestamp images on site, record continuous video from approach to discovery, and avoid edits that substitute narrative for chronology. Keep artifacts in situ until a neutral party can document context. Use agreed naming conventions that distinguish a mark from an inscription, and an inscription from a dated inscription. In turn, platforms can host mirrored evidence packets that cannot be retrofitted after a clip goes viral. None of these steps ruin the fun. They rescue the archive from being pulverized into reaction bait. A fourth layer is media literacy, tuned to this specific folklore. Viewers can enjoy the thrill of a reveal without treating symbols as self-authenticating. A triangle in a frame is ambiguous in the absence of stratigraphy, provenance, and handwriting comparison. A circle on stone may be a surveyor's aid, a mason's practice, or a child's doodle. Context decides. Nonetheless, context is difficult to sell in a 2-minute clip. That mismatch is where a responsible narrator earns trust. By naming the uncertainty, labeling reenactment, and separating what was seen from what was inferred. Trust grows when creators leave money on the table by refusing to level up a maybe into a must. The feedback loop also shapes the ground itself. Once a site trends, traffic rises, which means more footprints, more fresh marks, and more disturbed layers that complicate later testing. Consequently, landowners and counties have begun to write narrower access rules, and volunteer groups have started to publish etiquette for exploration that stresses non-destructive methods, respect for graves and churchyards, and strict adherence to property law. Those practices belong in the same drawer as skepticism. They protect history from enthusiasm. And they protect enthusiasm from the legal trouble that wrecks communities. Finally, the loop can be turned to good use when creators treat the audience as collaborators rather than as witnesses. Pre-registering search plans, sharing negative results, and opening raw data sets to independent review raise the standard across the board. To that end, a simple registry of claimed KGC marks with photographs, coordinates kept under seal, and documentable chains of custody would pay dividends. It would help separate local lore that deserves celebration from physical claims that deserve lab work. It would also make clear that a legend can be loved without being treated as a laboratory finding. Kept there, the hunt remains a civic pastime, and the archive remains intact for the harder tests to come. Across the border country, claims about hidden reserves often begin as images of initials on stone, or as folded sheets that look older than the hands that bring them forward. The appetite for a clean reveal is strong, and so is the urge to read a symbol as self-proving. However, the very conditions that make these stories travel fast also make them fragile when examined. A working set of criteria can separate keepsakes of memory from records that deserve a file, not by killing the romance, but by assigning honest weight to each piece. The stakes are practical. Communities want heritage tourism that lasts longer than a season, and researchers want a baseline that survives past a headline. Set correctly, the same framework that filters weak claims will also make a rare strong one legible to people who do not already believe. A screen that works in the field has to be portable, public-facing, and repeatable. Therefore, the rule begins at the point of first contact. Photograph the object or mark in place with scale and orientation visible. Record continuous video from approach to exit, and log the names of everyone present. Keep the item where it is until a neutral witness documents context. Then package it with tamper evidence and a signed chain of custody. For markings in caves or at bluffs, record stratigraphic position and surface condition, and note any modern disturbance. The goal is simple. Preserve context long enough that later laboratory work and archival cross-checks are not compromised by enthusiasm. 3 clusters carry the analytic load in any review, and each gains power when the others agree. Provenance and custody come first. A dated photograph, a ledger note in a traceable hand, a receipt that links a location to a person in a specific month all add weight. In turn, gaps are expected, which is why a transparent log of what is known and what is inferred matters. Next is material and stratigraphic testing. Paper, pigment, and ink can be profiled. Metal can carry residues that speak to period manufacture. Limestone and mortar can preserve tool marks with measurable characteristics. Layering matters at least as much as composition, because a 19th century object in a 20th century fill does not become older by proximity. Iconographic and textual evaluation sits beside the physical tests, not above them. Letter forms should be compared to known hands in datable samples, rather than to modern imaginations of how the past wrote. Spacing, stroke order, and placement relative to natural features can be measured and replicated by independent examiners. Nonetheless, a good visual match is not a substitute for dated context. Corroboration is the third pillar. Names on a sheet should meet names in letters, diaries, or county records that place those people within a reasonable distance of the site, and within a window that fits the claimed act. The route between places should respect terrain and transport of the era. A symbol found everywhere proves nothing about anywhere. A practical scoring rubric helps keep judgments from drifting with mood. Claims that score on all 3 pillars move from rumor to candidate. Claims that score lightly on one and poorly on the others stay in the folklore drawer, where they can still be honored as community memory. Disclosures about incentives matter as well, because revenue and attention can bend language. Creators who accept sponsorships, donations, or tour fees should declare those ties at the top of any packet, not as a footnote. A clear disclosure does not disqualify an effort. It simply gives reviewers the context needed to weigh certainty claims honestly. Registration and pre-planning raise standards for everyone involved. A simple online registry that accepts descriptions of proposed searches with coordinates under seal and access permissions attached allows independent observers to audit processes without trespass. Templates for stills, video, and custody logs keep formats consistent across counties and make comparison possible. When a claim matures into a site visit, the registry can assign an independent recorder who copies raw files for a mirror archive before any edit appears in public. That practice protects both the creator and the record. Finally, negative results should be counted as success. A site that fails a custody test or a layer test still teaches the next team where the traps are. When a symbol is found to be recent graffiti, the documentation that proves it can be filed beside the claim it refutes. Over time, that stack becomes a map of what the legend looks like in the wild, which is valuable in its own right. The work is incremental, but it moves. Each verified datum tightens the grid through which future stories must pass. Kept this way, the criteria do not drain the color from rebel gold. They preserve the one path by which a rumor can become a record. In 2001, the legend met a laboratory clock. Remains exhumed in the 1990s from a grave in Clay County had already been subjected to mitochondrial testing, and the new round refined the comparisons with documented maternal line descendants while tightening procedures around chain of custody. Tooth material and hair preserved by family provenance supplied additional strands, and independent labs repeated assays that converged on the same conclusion. Probability, not theater, carried the finding. The body in the Kearney grave aligned with the maternal line that included Jesse and his sister, which anchored the life to a death in St. Joseph in 1882. As a result, plot lines that required a long postscript under assumed names lost their footing, and the better cave tours began to adjust their language from survival rumors to memorial tone. The laboratory could not speak to caches or symbols on stone. It could speak to who is in the ground and when that life ended. A boundary that turns speculation about late-dated maps into a separate authorship problem, rather than an identity debate. The social effect matters because the outlaw's name had served as a license for every kind of itinerary. Once the identity was fixed, the license narrowed. Newspaper columns that once teased escape, years after St. Joseph, read thin beside a report that placed maternal markers in a named grave. Families who kept scrapbooks could keep their songs without insisting on a man who outlived his own funeral. Cave brochures that traded on the thrill of a fugitive at large found steadier ground in the language of remembrance and folklore. The emblem did not vanish. It matured. A Jesse waypoint could still sell a ticket, but the ticket no longer needed to promise a living conspirator beside a stash. In turn, treasure claims that leaned on extended lifespans had to reframe their pitch around different hands, different years, and different motives, which is where a stronger evidence frame earns its keep. A testable frame begins with discipline that keeps romance from smearing the record. Identity claims require documented kinship lines, written permissions, and custody logs signed at each handoff. Sampling must preserve context, with photographs and continuous video from approach to recovery. Labs must disclose methods, calibrations, and contamination controls, including negative controls that show what a clean run looks like. Replication across institutions is not a flourish. It is the proof that the finding is not a one-room trick. In this domain, mitochondrial profiles are often the workhorse, because maternal lines remain traceable across generations. Yet they answer only the question they are built for. They do not allocate deeds or vault keys. Autosomal markers can add resolution where reference relatives exist, and Y-line tests can contribute when paternal records are secure. However, none of these tools reach beyond identity into the realm of treasure unless an artifact bears biological traces that can be dated and tied to a documented chain. Therefore, a public-facing method should bundle biology with paper. A report that presents sequences without registers of kin is half a document. A register that charts a family tree without lab work is half a document in the other direction. The frame gains strength when laboratory summaries sit beside notarized affidavits, county records, and dated images that fix who handled what and when. If a claim asserts that a coded map is tied to the same hand as a tooth in a casket, The burden is clear. The map requires provenance that stands on its own legs, and the link requires a testable bridge that survives scrutiny. Where the bridge is missing, the fair reading is not accusation, it is classification. The map returns to the folklore drawer, where it can be admired as a cultural artifact rather than treated as a credential. Nonetheless, a community-friendly standard should leave room for future surprises. That means publishing the negative results that broke promising leads, so that the next round does not waste the same days and disturb the same ground. It means holding raw files in mirrored archives, where later reviewers can rerun analyses as techniques improve. It means declaring incentives at the top of every claim packet, so that readers can weigh certainty against the gravity of sponsorships and tour calendars. Most of all, it means treating the 2001 consolidation as a foundation, not as a muzzle. The identity anchor tamps down noise around survival legends, which frees attention for the harder questions that remain open. Applied to Rebel Gold, the consequence is modest and helpful. Identity is settled to the degree that modern science can settle a 19th century grave, so timelines should stop borrowing drama from false survival. That does not end interest in symbols or caches. It merely reroutes the inquiry through authorship, provenance, and context that can be documented without leaning on a man who had already been buried. A claim about KGC marks now lives or dies on its own merits, and a claim about a cache must bring forward records that stand outside the outlaw's lifespan. The story of how legends move through print, tourism, and memory can still be told with color and care. Proof rides a different rail. When the two are kept level and apart, communities keep their identity, visitors keep their wonder, and investigators keep a standard that will recognize a strong finding if and when one appears.